Welcome very, very much to Conversations, where I'm very pleased to welcome to the program here, introductorily, as it were, Bogdin Denich. And Bogdin Denich is the chairman, the one who's put together the 8th Annual Socialist Scholars Convention here in New York City. And Bogdin, welcome once again to Conversations.
It's good to be here, thank you.
A lot of things have gone on since 1989 and 1990 as far as the surveying of the left, as it were. A great deal of attention here at this conference on the meaning of what's going on in Eastern Europe and so forth. I wonder, how do you feel, being an overview, what do you see as the major questions that we might be addressing, and what's likely to be emerging out of this incredibly volatile situation that we see before us as we look at the daily newspaper?
I think the world as we know it is gone. The world of the last two generations after the Second World War is going to be dramatically changed, and nothing will be the same again. But it will take time to catch up. I think there are sort of three master trends taking place right now. One is the end of the communist model as a model of, for industrialized societies or for the third world. There may be a hangover here and there of a country here and there still keeping that one-party model going, but I think it's finished. I think as a consequence of that, in part, the Cold War, which has kept the U.S. going as the superpower, is also finished. And as a consequence of the first two, I think that European unification of 1992 is going to be dramatically more significant than it was going to be, because it will mean also the beginning of a divorce between the United States and Europe.
Yeah, right.
A unified Europe which won't be just a unified Western Europe.
That's
I think
right.
There'll be a Europe which will include parts of what used to be the Warsaw Pact. It will probably include some kind of a relationship with the Soviets. The Soviets that are talking about a common European home in which, as they put it, there'll be some rooms which will have Swiss furniture and some will have Finnish furniture.
Yeah, right.
So Finlandization is taking place, but it's Eastern Europe, not Western Europe, that's being Finlandized.
Yeah, the world is changing before our very eyes so incredibly. We did an interview a couple weeks ago with Ravi Batra, who had written on the Great Depression of the 1990s. He's written a new book called The Downfall. He called it The Downfall of Communism and Capitalism. Now, he feels that the Stalinist model, in any event, of a communist socialist system seems to have come down before our very eyes, but he also feels like we're heading for a Great Depression here in the West and in the capitalist world, and that we're on the verge of a cataclysmic transformation in terms of the world economic structure. Does that ring true to you at all, or what do you see?
I think that there has been a collapse of communism, and that there will be major stresses on the world market and on the world economy of an unprecedented sort, that there'll be major losers in this setup. For example, major losers will be the third world nations, the underdeveloped nations, because insofar as any aid is going to go anywhere for modernizing the economies, it's going to go to Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union in the first instance. Second place, we are pursuing a catastrophic policy in the United States, a criminal policy, I might add. What with a boondoggle with a 500 billion saving.
$500 to $600 billion.
Unbelievable.
There goes our peace dividend.
TV. There goes the peace dividend. There goes any potential aid that could have helped reconstruct some of these societies. And by the way, a society like ours, which was able to blow away money like that in order to build ever more complex arms systems, but won't spend a fraction of that to maintain not a peace dividend, but peace. Because I don't want Gorbachev's government collapsing. I don't want it replaced by a right-wing military dictatorship that may resume the arms race.
That could yet happen.
And that could yet happen. That's right. The cards have not yet been dealt. And we are not very hopeful at this present time. Europe has put up 12 to 15 times as much aid on the table as we have, and they've only begun to talk. Now, of course, one consequence of America being a poor world power and poor because of its own choosing, because of the irresponsibility of its own leadership. That idiotic, criminal, read my lips nonsense from the president, and the treatment of tax as the dirty word of our politics rather than steal.
It's like Marie Antoinette, the deficit queen.
That's right.
The deficit, and we're in hock, as it were, to the Japanese, and the Japanese values on the stock market just dropped 30% since February 18th.
That's right. And further, you can't be a superpower with Japanese money and German money. After all, why should they lend us money to throw our weight around in parts of the world they're interested in? Now, it happens.
Can you see a collapse of the capitalist world? Or
no, I can see a serious series of inefficiencies developing in that, and a major drop in the role of the United States as a world power. Because we are a world power now, in the same way that the Soviets were a world power for the past 20 years, primarily as a military power. We are not an example of a decent social order. We are not particularly a leader of democracy anymore. Because in point of fact, we sent, in this year of democratic revolution, we support Peking, which crushes its students in democratic uprising. We stand behind Pol Pot, the butcher of Cambodia. And we have some extraordinary, unlovely friends throughout Latin America. There's more murder going on in Guatemala than in all of Eastern Europe put together.
All of these things have to be addressed, and you wonder, where are the crowds that would fill the squares of Wenceslas Square? Where are they in the United States, and when would they come forth in righteous indignation at some of the things that are going on? Ravi Batra, in our piece we did, pointed out that the ownership by the upper 1% of the population in the United States has now reached close to 40% of all capital assets by the upper 1%. Incredible.
We have the kind of income differences, forget even the ownership part, which is horrendous, but even in income differences.
Even income, yeah.
Yeah, if you take, for example, that there are actually go-go Wall Street paper pushers who get $20 million, $20 million for turning our economy into a gambling den.
Yeah, Michael Milligan gets
That's right.
$5 million. I mean, you know.
Now, a person on minimum wages would have to work how long to make that kind of money?
Oh, it's laughable. It's laughable. It's a laughable.
We're talking hundreds of centuries, and when we talk about a social utility, let's say he's useful. That much more useful.
Yeah, right, yeah.
And, you know, a society which, with all of its virtues, and there are many virtues in our society, has a squalid metropolitan core in every major part of the country. You can't walk in my city at night anymore safely. The transport is collapsing. Our educational system is at the bottom of the pile of the 13 major industrial countries. We are now turning out kids who will not be able to compete in the world economy.
That's right, yeah.
And we are turning out kids who are locking down at the bottom of the society. And I think that it's the terrible part of it is that we've been enormously successful in one thing, and that is convincing the bulk of Americans that politics are a dirty mug's game, and that nothing much can be changed.
Yeah, you mentioned before the fact that there's a certain kind of, some people say it's the end of the Cold War. We have to listen to articles by Francis Fukuyama telling us we've come to the end of history and so forth, but that there is this dialectic that there has been against the evil, locus of evil of communism. One wonders, where is that locus likely to become in the minds of some of our policymakers and so forth, and wonders whether or not there's going to be a very, very nasty kind of open clash between the North and the South, the have and the have-nots, as a problem area. And I just wonder that the United States, which has 40% owned by the upper 1%, virtually 5% own all of the capital assets, as it were. There's a sycophant institution headed by sycophant executives that administer wage slave trickle down that doesn't trickle down and litters our streets. We do not have a moral or political or economic philosophy that allows us to resonate to the needs of the underclass or the poor in our own society, much less the world.
And I wonder if that isn't going to be...
a moral malaise and an ethical malaise that we can see becoming part of the United States scene, as it were. I mean,
I think that's true.
Because we don't have that kind of a system that allows us to address the needs of the body politic in a large-scale sense of all the peoples of the world.
I think that there are two forces which appear as a world force still that attempt to address this sort of thing. One is Catholicism, which does talk of the North, South, and of the desperate needs of the poor.
Liberation.
Not just liberation theology, even the official church.
Yeah, okay.
Even the official church says that that we live in a world with a fundamentally unjust world order, where billions are sent on armaments of little military cliques and children die of starvation. And second place, the world social democracy, the Socialist International, with a Brandt Manley plan, which does a very interesting thing. It says the North cannot stay prosperous unless it can trade with the South. It cannot trade with the South if the South is starving. The present world debt that those countries are carrying prevents them from buying anything and prevents them from being able to restructure their economies. So if you want to deal with the problem of terrorism and with a menace to democracy, you just have to get rid of the world debt, which, by the way, is smaller than what we're doing for savings and loans. Where it's a question of loans which were forced on a number of those underdeveloped countries by us, when we in effect twisted people's arm to take loans, when we needed to launder the petrodollars that we had from the Saudis to think. It's not good to think of one's country as being one of the sources of major problems now in the world. And not only is the evil empire going, but we're set up increasingly for the bad guys. We're not the white hats anymore.
It's an amazing change.
And you have to remember, right after World War II, I remember when American soldiers were in Europe, America was popular.
Absolutely.
It was the liberal country which was helping
the light to the
aid
world,
and everything
light
else.
onto the world, and it's gone, or it feels like it is gone. And
even in the Cold War, early years of the Cold War, there was, in addition to everything else, a kind of idealism which did convince lots of decent young people to go into the Peace Corps, to go into the various other. There's nothing of that anymore. Possessive individualism has become the ideology.
It may be because there is, I don't know if it is because there's a malaise, what the source of greed and that sort of thing is, a sense of hopelessness in terms of there being a system that we have. Marxism in its tradition and the difficulties it had at least used to try and base itself on the premise that we need deal with the plight of the poor people of the world. We do not have that system, and we haven't, but the capitalist model has not, and we do not have that.
Well, the capitalist model, if you take it in its abstract form, assumes that it's self-regulating. And, of course, Adam Smith never assumed that the state would ignore the starving and the poor. Adam Smith's model, by the way, is not what we have. And it's not that...
Monopolistic.
That's the first place we're dealing with monopolies. But second place, the assumption is that there are certain things that the state needs to do. In his days, he talked about the state taking care of education, of transportation, of defense, and of the minimum needs of the poor. Now, it's when you look at the society, the naked greed which has been legitimated under the Reagan years. It was bad before, but it really got terrible during the Reagan years. In effect, was able to work because a number of people were getting theirs. The yuppies, the young go-getters, the people who were speculating in real estate, the junk bond dealers, all of those people who are really utterly useless in the society. And the people who have been devalued have been honest working people who, in effect, have had a drop in living standards for the past decade. Quite apart from those whose jobs have vanished and have been replaced with terrible so-called service sector jobs. Steel workers who are now pushing hamburgers.
I know. And the streets are littered with people that can't even do that. And it's the problems are so legion and so forth. And now there are too few places where these problems are addressed. It seems to me I'd like to congratulate you, if I may, as one of the coordinators or the major coordinator of this conference, a major conference in terms of social critics of the society who call these things to attention. Congratulate you on this and to say thank you really very much for putting it together. And we wanted to do an introductory thing. We're going to do an interview with some of the people here at this 8th Annual Socialist Scholars Convention here in New York City. And so, Bogdin, thank you. Really, we could go on talking for hours.
Thank you.
But thank you very,
Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Please stay tuned. We'll be coming right back momentarily with more from the conference. Thank you, Bogdin, very much. Welcome very, very much to this segment of Conversations, where I'm pleased and honored to welcome to the program Irving Howe, is the editor of Dissent magazine. And Mr. Howe, welcome very, very much to the conversation.
Thank you.
I would like to, at the outset, congratulate you. It's your 35th year, I guess, that Dissent has been publishing. I wonder, maybe just briefly, came out of that 1954 McCarthy era.
We began in 54. There were two main reasons for starting the magazine. One, we were dissatisfied with the response of many American intellectuals to McCarthyism. We thought some of them were caving in and some of them were evading. We wanted to take a strong stand against the thug from Wisconsin. And secondly, more germane to our own narrow experiences, the socialist movement had been in a state of disintegration and crisis in America, and we decided that being in a small group, a small sect, was no longer profitable, and that the best thing we could do would be to publish a magazine, a quarterly of ideas, which would reach perhaps a limited audience, but provide the intellectual seed work for a revival of our thought.
Do you think we're at a time again of appropriateness for us to think anew the situation with the incredible events that have taken place over the last year? Or generally, what is your sense of things now in April of 1990?
The events in first in America, the country suffered a prolonged attack of sleeping sickness under Ronald Reagan, and George Bush hasn't done anything to wake anybody up. So we have a curious situation where the whole world seems to be in ferment, alive, exciting, good, bad, but alive. Whereas in America, where we have such an accumulation of serious social problems, nothing seems to be happening, at least on the domestic front. As for what's going on in Eastern Europe, there's the good and the bad. The good, of course, is that the Stalinist dictatorships have been overthrown. That's the overriding central good. And with it, that people have taken their fate into their own hands, that they went into the streets, they demonstrated, they formed a plethora of political parties. They've shown that the idea of a passive, atomized population is either not true at all or no longer true. So that we are living through a wonderful event, the end of communist totalitarianism. The bad side, and this is from my own point of view, is that in Eastern Europe, intellectuals and others have become infatuated with something called the market. Now, everyone of sense agrees that a certain element of market economy has to be introduced into Eastern Europe, but nevertheless, the market there has become a magical term, and these people aren't aware of the many ways in the West that the market has negative, antisocial aspects to it. They've become, just as some of them were once true believers in a centrally bureaucratized command economy planned from above by Communist Party apparatchiks, so now they have become devotees of what you might call Thatcherism. The irony of this is that they become devotees of Thatcherism at a time when Mrs. Thatcher is rapidly, I'm glad to say, sinking politically.
Do you think that might change if and as there are unemployment things experienced and some of the negative sides of this?
Absolutely. It'll take 3-4 years. I think there's really no alternative toward a marketization of the economy, and there has desirable elements in Eastern Europe. For one thing, on a simple practical level, these countries are virtually, some of them totally bankrupt, and they need capital. The only place they can get it is from Western Europe. But I think there could be at least a kind of social democratic safety net unemployment insurance, various trainings for workers who are let go, something resembling the welfare state as we know it in Western Europe and America, more in Western Europe than America, but something resembling the welfare state is also going to be needed in these countries, so that the social struggles which will occur, I believe, in some of these East European countries will take place 2, 3, 4 years from now. Nobody knows exactly how long. But the current euphoria, the period of fraternity which occurs after a successful revolution, will come to an end.
How about this country? Do you see that there could be a reaction to the what many people see as a social and economic malaise in this country? Or when will we fill our squares as they did in Wenceslas Square? And what? How long can we go on a $500 billion bailout of the savings and loan?
Isn't that extraordinary?
And
it's even more, I think, than $500 billion.
$500 to $600 billion. Yeah. There goes our peace deficit.
There goes the peace dividend, and due to an orgy of corruption which was encouraged by the Reagan administration, which is in fact the direct consequences of the deregulation put into effect by the Reagan administration, that you know that today in America there's been a recurrence of child labor. Amazing. We thought that this was done with 50 years ago. I remember when child labor was abolished by law under the New Deal. And now it is rising up all over the country, very difficult to cope with because it also involves a lot of unregistered immigrants. You have 500,000 kids floating around the country now, homeless, jobless, drifting around just in the way people drifted during the 30s. I'm not saying you have anything like the Depression of the 30s, of course not. But the social problems in the country, the decay of the cities, the fact that some 40 million people don't have health insurance. I could list dozens of problems, but I'm sure everyone listening to this will know these problems as well as I do. And it is indeed, it's a kind of mystery why there isn't more social response, why people don't rise up and say something in this country. It's partly due to the ineffectuality of the Democratic leadership in Congress, which is very timid and flabby and very weak.
Yeah, the establishment, the concentration of ownership, Ravi Batra has noted, has gotten up close to 40%, is now owned by the upper 1%.
That's
5%
right.
Virtually own it all.
The extreme inequality of wealth has become much worse under Reagan. The living standards of ordinary workers have gone down something like 10% in the last 7 or 8 years.
Incredible.
All of this...
With a 2,000 rise in the Dow Jones.
Right. There's bound to be some reaction unless we're entering a period of history which is totally different from anything that we've ever known.
Yeah. We're speaking now in early April of 1990. Yeah. The Japanese stock market, the value of the stocks traded in the Japanese market have dropped by a full 30% since February. Yeah. We live in an interrelated international order.
International economy.
Can you see in any kind of way the possibility, we've seen in a certain sense the collapse, as you say, of a Stalin's communist model. Can you see anything coming, collapse or something worse than
not a total
recession?
Collapse.
You can't see a depression
not a total
coming
collapse, but I can see a severe recession. After all, under Reagan in 81, 82,
terrible.
There was a very severe recession, and the distinction between a severe recession and a depression is really a semantic distinction.
Really,
it's very hard to say what the difference is. One of the things that strikes me very strongly, I grew up when I was a kid in a trade union home. To scab, that was looked upon as the worst thing you could do, except maybe a religious conversion. I mean, a strike was looked upon as sacred. I mean, when other people went on strike, nobody would dare go to scab. And today, the New York Times, with its Pecksniffian piety, speaks of replacement workers. They're not replacement workers, they're scabs. And to me, it's astonishing that there can be such a change of feeling, that the loss of solidarity among workers, among ordinary people, the one thing you don't do is go out and scab on another human being who's taken the risk of going on strike. Going on strike isn't pleasant. It's something that people simply have to do at times.
Yeah, we know that from, was it Pittston, Piltdown? The strike's been going on viciously. Greyhound.
Yeah, Greyhound, especially.
There are some of those things, but there's
it's
precious
really
little
quite
support
astonishing.
for, or precious little sense among the general society for a sense of what might be called righteous outrage.
Or solidarity.
And a willingness to accept almost in a bovine kind of way whatever they bring down the pike.
And a loss of common solidarity, that you stick together with other people. I mean, it took decades for this sense of solidarity to grow up, and the early union struggles in this country were so bitter and so terrible until this sense of solidarity was achieved, and now it seems to have been lost. I think it's partly a consequence of the Reaganite ideology. It must be said for Reagan that though I found his politics detestable, he was successful in some ways. He did succeed in changing many of the moral feelings and social styles of the country.
Certainly did.
And the extreme individualism that he encouraged, screw you, Jack, no, I got mine, I don't care about you, and that kind of thing, which ranges all the way from scabbing to, you see a young, healthy young man knocking down an old lady to get into a taxi cab in New York City, and you see it very often. All of these things are the signs of the breakdown of communal, a sense of community, without which a society can't survive.
Well, when you live in a society where the concentration of the wealth is so incredible, where the institutions do administer by highly paid and necessarily sycophant executives to that wealth, a system of what Marxists would call wage-slave trickle-down economics, which doesn't trickle down increasingly.
No, it doesn't trickle down
with increased
very much.
Technological input to production itself. I wonder if there isn't a sense of malaise among the general society in that we do not have a system that allows us to, in a certain sense, resonate to the needs of the poor, underclass peoples of our own society, much less the world.
Yes. Well,
and that since we don't have that and it's needed, that at a psychological level, people are just in a state of moral decay or malaise. There
is a malaise in the society. Poor Jimmy Carter lost the election because he said in public that there was a malaise. And of course he was right. I guess politically it would have been wiser not to say it, but it was an honest and accurate statement. There is a very deep malaise in the society, and yet, you know, one of the great mysteries of social life is how change occurs. We were living in the late 50s. You're all old enough to remember. We were living in the late 50s under Eisenhower. It seemed the same sort of, not as bad, but there was a lot of dullness and unresponsiveness to social questions. And then suddenly in the early 60s, everything began to open up. There was the Freedom Rise, there was the election of Jack Kennedy. A whole new atmosphere was created. Exactly how and why that happened, I at least can't entirely explain. So it's entirely possible a year or two from now we have to be patient and keep slogging away at social criticism and social action. It's entirely possible something of the same thing will happen again.
Well, Professor Schlesinger has said these things move in pendulum swings back and forth, and perhaps they do in a broader historical.
Well, Arthur, I've had this argument with Arthur. I said to him, Arthur, you know, I see the pendulum swinging one way, but I don't see it swinging back.
It's going off the
And he said, that's because you're impatient. And I say, well, you may well be right.
Well, you should be impatient, sir, if I may say so. You've been impatient with the injustice that there has been there, which has reached almost a crescendo in the time in which you and I speak. And I congratulate you very, very much on the 36 years of publishing of Dissent, and may you have 36 more years of dissent, and may it be even so that we could arrive finally at a society where we wouldn't have to have dissent. That would be grand, but I can't hardly imagine that.
There'll always be a need for dissent, small d, but there isn't necessarily going to be one, capital D.
Like we should have now. Well, you've been a voice of that, and I thank you very much for all of that. And I would remind you in the cable audience, it's been a pleasure for you to have the perception. Irving Howe, the editor-founder of Dissent magazine, a major voice of dissent, legitimate dissent here in the society. Society and a major person contributing here at the 8th Annual Socialist Scholars Convention here in New York City, April 1990. Thank you for viewing. We invite you to stay tuned. There'll be more coming up from the convention momentarily. Mr. Howe, once again, thank you really very, very much indeed. Stay tuned. We're coming right back. Welcome back now to Conversations. We're pleased to welcome to the program Stuart Weir. Mr. Weir is the editor of the New Statesman, and welcome very, very much to Conversations and to New York, if I may say so.
Thank you.
It's nice to get a perspective of Britain. Things are changing there in a very, very important kind of way. It would seem to us as we look at the situation there, there have been riots recently over this poll tax thing and so forth. I wonder if you could give us a sense of what the political realities are as far as Britain, Thatcherism and so forth is concerned. Here, April 1990.
I think what we're seeing is a popular revolt against Mrs. Thatcher and her politics, which has come as a complete surprise to all of us, I think. Certainly for Mrs. Thatcher, but I think for those of us who have always opposed her policies, I think it's come as a surprise to us too. I was in Trafalgar Square for the riots the other day as an observer, you know. I'm not very good at throwing rocks. And I was completely astonished to see thousands of young working class Londoners, men and women, in their kind of ordinary gear, you know, jeans, t-shirts, out for a good day, suddenly turn against the police in the way that they did, and because they were being pushed around by the police. And what I think has happened is that they came to the demonstration to protest against being pushed around by Mrs. Thatcher. They found themselves being pushed around by the police, and they said, enough is enough, and you had a riot on your hands.
And it is a certain group of society, or is it a widespread sense of being, as you put it, pushed around by Mrs. Thatcher?
Oh, I think very widespread.
It is becoming widespread.
It already is.
Yeah.
Some of the pollsters have done a new question.
Yes.
About people's attitude towards Mrs. Thatcher. Has she gone too far? Do you want to get rid of her? And around about 80% of the population are saying that she's gone too far, she doesn't listen to ordinary people, and so on. That's a very, very high figure. That's consensus level. And we tested this out. We went to a very typical English town, a new town, lots of home ownership, people who've benefited in the past from her policies. And we went around asking people how they felt about Mrs. Thatcher now. And the level of dislike of Mrs. Thatcher was really breathtaking.
Really? Yeah.
Well, the most popular fantasy in that town was people who wanted to kick Mrs. Thatcher up the arse.
Right. And these would have been people who might have, a few years back,
these are people
been very much in favor of her.
These are people who voted for her in 79, probably 83, possibly 87, certainly not now. It's not just the poll tax, by the way.
Yeah, all right.
The National Health Service is one of the most popular institutions we have in our country.
Yeah.
And people are really scared that she's going to take privatization right across health as well. And they don't want that, and it could be her undoing.
We had an incredibly popular president in Ronald Reagan who went out of office being very, very popular, having had a major change as far as the United States was concerned. People who would have been of a progressive nature have a hard time understanding that popularity. We who observe Britain have had, in a certain sense, a hard time understanding what was the source of what seemed to be the indomitable lady. There was such popularity. What was the source of her popularity among the British people that they would elect year after year with, and she seemed to be invincible in a certain political sense over that rather long period?
Well, I think you've got to bear in mind two special factors. One is actually she was never personally popular. She was respected. She was thought to be someone who would get things done. She did things like take on the trade unions, which people had perceived to be overpowerful. She made people more prosperous in the short term. So all those things, but she was never very popular. And the other thing is that she never ever got above 38% of the national vote in any election. So that her governments, although she had, because we have a very crazy system like yours, we have 3 parties, not 2. So the election results get distorted. And she never actually had a majority of the popular vote ever. And her majorities fell from around about 38, 39% down to about 34%. And she was still getting big majorities in the House of Commons.
I see.
But she wasn't earning the votes for those seats.
Well, we have a continuation in our country, if I may say so, of Mr. Reagan. We call it Reagan-Bush administration. It is a continuation. Seems to be a continuation of that. You don't see that emerging in Britain? Do you see a change? Do you see Labour coming in? Or What do you see coming? What is the likely outcome of this as we begin to look some months out?
It really depends whether Thatcher stays as leader of the Conservative Party.
Okay.
If she does, I think Labour will end up the largest party in Parliament after the next election, but they won't necessarily have a majority in the House of Commons. If Mrs Thatcher is replaced by, say, Michael Heseltine, who advocates policies very close to those of the Labour Party in social policy, in the economy, in training, but is strong on defence and strong on law and order and so on, then you could see Conservatives winning the next election, but I think only if they change.
What is your sense of what is actually going to emerge, your own sense?
Well, I don't know many Conservatives personally very well, so they don't really confide in me.
Yeah.
But my guess is that they are political animals, that they want to win more than they want anything else. There's not much liking for Mrs Thatcher in the parliamentary party or in her own cabinet. I think we could very well see her winkled out over the next year.
We here in the United States are just reeling from certain things, at least certain social critics are and so forth. We just come to find our leadership telling us we have a $500 to $600 billion bailout of our savings and loan institutions. One of our congressmen just commented, there goes the defense advantage. So we've had this kind of a sense of this, and we have a tremendous sense of, among many people, a sense of malaise, being able to reach fundamental questions of how we're going to organize our society. What's the general tone and feel in Britain of the society? Do you feel, I mean, is there a sense of malaise, or is it similar? You're familiar with the United States and so forth. Is there a similarity there, or?
Well, yes, certainly. I mean, Mrs Thatcher was supposed to halt our national decline. That's why she was given the preeminence she was. But people are now perceiving that her policies haven't in fact worked, that the public sphere where we live most of our lives, you know, transport, public transport, the roads, law and order, public order and so on, actually has deteriorated, while not many people, not enough people share in the benefits of the of private activity. And we know that our economy, this economic miracle that was being boasted of 2 or 3 years ago, was largely an illusion, and that our manufacturing capacity now has been shot to pieces, and that we cannot survive in the world as a service economy. So the last hope for Britain is to go into Europe in 1992, into a Europe that is socially conscious as well as economically strong, and where there'll be the chance for us to share in the general prosperity and in a sense become part of Greater Germany, really. I think you in the States are in a long-term position far stronger, because you still have quite a lot of manufacturing capacity left, and you have a very much better innovatory skills in terms of technology and so on than we have in our country.
Yeah, that may all well be so. We did an interview with Ravi Batra. I'm not sure if you're familiar. He predicts a Great Depression that is coming. He'd written a best-selling book here, and he pointed out that something on the order, now it's gotten up close to 40% of all the capital assets in the United States are now owned by the upper 1% of our population. 5% virtually own it all as far as the capital assets of the United States. What is the situation in Britain as far as ownership of capital assets are concerned?
Well, it's very similar. Well, you have to distinguish between personal wealth and corporate wealth these days, I think. I mean,
well, it's non-residential assets. I mean,
well, obviously, there are many now large multinational companies that own major capital property assets and major plant and so on. But in terms of personal wealth, the figures are very similar to those in the United States, with a very, very small fractions owning disproportionate amounts of capital. I think the top 1% owns about 33%, 40% of the nation's wealth.
In Britain, it's about similar to that.
Yeah.
These figures tend to move glacially. I mean, they don't tend to move that much. It is amazing to me that it couldn't gotten up to 40% is owned by that. Mr. Batra, among others, and then we look at the Japanese stock market has lost 30% of its value since February 18 or so, this being early April of 1990. You can't see possibly there being a runaway sort of the downfall of communism has occurred in a certain sense, or a Stalinist model in any event. You don't see any major thing beyond recession, a depression, or some sort of a major deflating of the capitalist, world capitalist system that might come from Japan or from the United States? Or do you see anything on that order?
I don't think when I said about the States, I simply said they were in a better position than Britain.
Yeah.
I think the United States is in real trouble because they've been an economic imperial power, and they're now losing those colonies, as it were. I mean, Europe will now be a major competitor with the United States. There's a whole market wiped out. There's Japan and all the countries of the Pacific Rim, and so I think that you have lost an empire in a sense, and I think you'll have a really bad period adjusting to that. And I hope to hell, for the sake of ordinary people in America, you don't take as long adjusting it to it as the British ruling class did, because they took far too long, and as a result we are now limping along behind all the major industrial nations, and I think America needs to readjust very, very fast. You can't go on as complacently as you are at the moment. But I don't think the world economy now depends so much upon the United States to carry it through. I mean,
and you don't see anything on the horizon like beyond a recession, a depression or something on that order, a major economic calamity that might be accompanying some of these interrelated things?
I think that most of the advanced nations now are very, very careful to make sure that no major either domestic or international depression occurs, and when things like the savings problems and so on.
$600 billion.
Yeah, well, that will be taken care of by the state. The state cannot afford to allow that to collapse. And in Britain we had a very similar thing in the 70s, where the whole property market, and therefore tied to that all of the insurance and assurance and pensions and so on in our country were liable to come toppling down. And a Labour government came in and saved capitalism from itself. And you can be sure a capitalist government will do that.
Capitalist government be able to do that. Well, okay, I hope you're right, in a sense that we don't have such a major calamity that might be occurring. It gets a little bit queasy sometimes when you try and feel and sense the malaise that there can be felt here in the United States as we look at our homeless and other kinds of problems that we have, and the injustices that do exist and are allowed to continue. And then some of these other international indicators that indicate that while Mr. Fukuyama is celebrating the end of history, that same kind of problem might begin to affect us here in the West. And so
Mr. Fukuyama must be blind and deaf, because you walk around New York. To my mind, I've seen things in New York which I saw in Bombay, a third world country. The conditions in this particular city are dreadful and disgusting. Human beings should not live in them, and anyone who says there's to be no change and that liberal democracy works and lives in Washington, and where conditions are as bad as they are in New York, has got to be blind, deaf and dumb, because too much leaning towards the establishment to tell the truth.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, and that there's a moral malaise in that we don't have a way of relating to that problem of our own, much less those of the world, on a larger scale. So if this is a system that lets us relate to that, I think it gives a moral malaise within this society, which is very, very disheartening. But in any event, that's a larger issue perhaps and so forth. And I'm sorry we run out of time. We haven't got nearly enough time to talk with you. I'd like to again thank you really very, very much for participating briefly in this, and again to welcome you to New York.
Okay, thanks.
It's been your pleasure to have the perceptions of Stuart Weir. He's the editor of the New Statesman of London, here at the Socialist 8th Annual Socialist Scholars Convention, New York City. Happy to have been able to bring you his perceptions. Please stay tuned. There'll be more coming up from the conference momentarily. Stuart, once again, thank you very, very much indeed.
Right, no, pleasure.
Stay tuned. We're coming right back. Thank you. Welcome back now. We're very pleased to welcome to the program here from the Socialist Scholars Convention in April of 1990, Daniel Singer, European editor for The Nation magazine. And Daniel Singer, welcome very, very much to Conversations. We were both at this convention last year. Incredible year as far as the situation, as far as Europe is concerned. Were you yourself, who was a very knowledgeable person in terms of European developments within a world context, surprised by the rapidity and the nature of the changes that have occurred in Eastern Europe, or in Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe?
I would say one should have to draw a difference between the trends and the pace of events. And I think a little anecdote will really illustrate that. Last May I was in Warsaw, and I was sitting with a gentleman who was an intellectual, fairly influential within Solidarity. We were on the eve of the Polish election. Everybody already knew that this election will bring a victory for Solidarity and a defeat for the communist government. And he was saying that in view of what was going to happen, probably the fact that he decided not to stand for Parliament would be a setback to his career, more or less. And I was consoling him by saying, after all, to be the editor of the Solidarity Weekly, you see, was quite an important thing. What we didn't know, either he nor I, was that 3 months later, this gentleman, because this was Tadeusz Mazowiecki, would be the Prime Minister of Poland. That obviously shows the extraordinary pace of events, because within the following 6 months, you had not only Hungary and Poland changing and getting rid of the communist government, but you had this movement sweeping across Eastern Europe, and the same thing happening in Berlin and in Prague and in Sofia, and then finally even Ceausescu, even the Caligula of Romania was swept aside as well. So the pace of events was to some extent a surprise, but not the trends, because they were written, one could foresee that these regimes, which by then were really only standing by the fact that they were propped up by the threat of Soviet intervention, would be swept aside the moment Gorbachev, in his perestroika, would drop what was called the Brezhnev doctrine, that is to say, the threat of that intervention. So the very fact, you can say in a sense, that what was happening at the periphery was determined by the center, and that Gorbachev in some way, willingly or unwillingly, was the stage manager of that extraordinary upheaval. So in that sense, surprised by the pace, but not by the various trends. Now, what we have to ask ourselves really is, what did happen in these countries of Eastern Europe? What has come to an end there? I mean, this is the end of an era, it is the twilight of a reign, but we have to ask ourselves, what has come to an end? And I think that we can have two very clear answers and then one question mark. The clear answers are that this is the end of an experiment, a tragic experiment in exported revolution. That is to say, in a revolution that was brought to these countries not only from above, but from outside. Being from outside, obviously it was by its very nature from above. That experiment, it's true that it was brought by the Red Army, and we shouldn't forget that this was by a Red Army that at the time was liberating Europe from the Nazis, but it was an experiment from outside and from above, and this is the end of that experiment. The other certainty is that this is the end of the Stalinist or the neo-Stalinist system throughout Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union itself. You may remember, if you're old enough, that back in 1956, Nikita Khrushchev, who was then the Soviet leader, made a very famous indictment of Stalin, and it was a sort of, in a symbolic way, he brought the statue of Stalin down. But it took all that time, roughly a third of a century, for the whole edifice to fall to pieces and to be brought down, and that's what has happened now. These are two certainties. The question mark, I think, that we have to ask ourselves is whether the Soviet experiment, in a sense, has come to an end. Whether 1917, whether 1917 will be taken as a date as significant as, let's say, 1789, that is to say, the beginning of the French Revolution that we were celebrating a year ago. Whether it was the beginning of a new era or of a new period, or whether in some way it will be a tragic, however heroic, attempt to find a shortcut, which leads finally, if not to a dead end, back to capitalism. I don't know what the answer is going to be, but this is a question that we now have to ask ourselves. Having said that, I would say there is an attempt that is being made, there is a tremendous propaganda against we socialists, we have to react, And this is the propaganda which says the events of Eastern Europe show three things. They show that this is the end and the final funeral of socialism. Secondly, that this proves the eternity of capitalism. And the third thing which flows from that, logically, and that is to say that history has come to an end, that capitalism is the culmination and the end of history, as a certain gentleman, Mr. Fukuyama, did write in a popular fashion. A sort of poor man's Hegel, if I can say. All right. Now, I think that it's easy, but it's quite important to answer these three questions, and one can answer them really quite easily, but it's important to do so. First, I would say that to die, you cannot say that a thing has died if it hasn't lived. You must have lived to have died. And for socialism to have died in Europe, in Eastern Europe, it must have lived beforehand. It did not. What we had in these countries, unfortunately, whether we like it or not, over that period is, if I can paraphrase the fashionable sentence, it was really inexisting socialism. It was not a regime which had anything common with socialism. And in fact, the identification of socialism, the identification of the Marxist dream with the Stalinist nightmare, and the identification of socialism and communism with Soviet repression or the Soviet tank has done quite a lot of harm to the socialist idea. So that's the first answer. The second answer is that the very same people who are now reciting funeral orations for socialism are the people who only a few years ago were proclaiming with exactly the same conviction, try to remember Jean Kirkpatrick, for instance, that totalitarian communism was just immutable, that it would never change, that really the evil empire was so bad and so evil because it was a hell from which there was no exit, from which you couldn't get out. Now, if prophets like that are now saying that capitalism is eternal, maybe socialism has quite a future. And the third point I would make, and that's about Mr. Fukuyama and company, is that they haven't discovered America. They're not doing anything very exceptional. They're doing what the servants of the establishments have always done, that is to say, to proclaim that history did exist, but it came to an end with the victory of their masters. Now, what do you expect? Seriously, did you expect any other philosophy from people who are the servants of their masters? So these are the 3 points. But obviously, it's not enough for us just to mark points, to score points. We have to ask our questions, and I think it's important for us to ask ourselves questions: what has collapsed, why it has collapsed, and what will take its place. And this was one of the objects of our discussions here.
Indeed. What will take its place in your view? What's likely to emerge in the year ahead as we begin to look ahead from 1990 to 1991, 92, 90? What will emerge as far as you can see things?
Since obviously in a program like that we cannot elaborate in great detail, I would make a difference between what you're saying, a year ahead, and the years ahead.
All right.
In the immediate future, I think all these countries will move more or less in a capitalist direction for a period. That is to say, and I think so, that they'll do so, if I have to oversimplify, because if you open up your frontiers, if you have the convertibility of your currency, if you lose the control over your foreign trade, and you have a competition between two systems, of which one is more productive than the other and has a superior technology, knowing the nature of the capitalist market, it will invade anything that it can invade, and it will have an impact. And all these economies, I think, will be moving in the capitalist direction. Let me make it quite clear what I mean by capitalist direction. I don't mean simply that there will be some market, because in any transition to socialism, you'll have a long period of a mixed economy and therefore a market. The real test is that what is the purpose, what is the direction of that economy? Whether in the long run you're aiming at a society which will determine and shape its investment, its consumption, its production, its way of life by a self-organization, or whether it will be determined by the forces of the market. I'm saying that the first moves will be in that later direction, in that of the forces of the market. That's the answer for the next year, as we say. But what happens after? There is the big question mark. What happens when these countries in Eastern Europe discover that what they are being offered as a prospect is not a choice between, let's say, between social democratic Sweden or Thatcherite Britain, but the choice that they are really offered concretely is one, let's say, between Mexico and Bolivia. When they discover that, when they discover also under the glittering surface of our societies the seamy side of these societies, when they discover the unemployment that it brings to them, the big social differences, then appears the question mark. What will they do at that second stage? Will they accept it or won't they accept it? I think it can be summed up in a different way. The answer, I mean, I can only hedge because we're not prophets and we don't know what's going to happen, but I'll do it in such a way. I think that these societies were more complex than they are being now described in this moment of reckoning and taking accounts of the bankruptcy proceedings of these societies. They were more complex because you had societies in which there was a tremendous gap between the project and the reality, between the theory and the practice, between the dream, if you want, and the reality. And that huge gap obviously made people cynical, made them apolitical, spread apathy and the disgust with socialism, and the discredit not only of really existing socialism, that is to say of these regimes, but the discredit of the socialist idea itself. That was one thing. But at the same time, all these things that were being said in the ideal, in some ways were penetrating into these societies. That is to say, the ideas of social justice and so on. And how do we see that? Is that the technocrats of these countries, whether you are in Prague or in Warsaw, or whether you are in Kiev or Moscow or Leningrad, you talk to the technocrats, they're not very different from the technocrats you meet in this country, and they look as if they were, I mean, they sound as if they were emerging from the Harvard Business School, and as if they were looking for a job at the International Monetary Fund, and they all tell you one thing, and it's an echo, a refrain that comes back always the same. What do they say? It's terrible, you know, the greatest difficulty we have in our societies, it's with the population. This population is too fond of social justice and too egalitarian. Now, this really is a kind of socialist subconscious in these societies. And what we don't know is what will prove stronger in the long run, whether it will be this discredit and rejection, stronger and more lasting, whether it will be this discredit and this rejection of the socialist ideal because of the practice it had, or whether it will be this socialist unconscious that I just described of social justice and equality. Now, I think it's up to us in the West, if we want to contribute to in some way, is to help that it should be the second which prevails.
Amen. Thank you very, very much. Please, if you could just thank you very much for a succinct summation of things such as that. And I would just like to thank you really very, very much. Daniel Singer, European editor for The Nation. Happy to have been able to bring you his perceptions. We in Conversations invite you to tune in again next week. I'm sorry we don't have 3 hours to allow you to elaborate further, and I do thank you very, very much for participating. That's it for this particular program. We will be coming back to Conversations next week. Again, Daniel Singer, thank you once again very, very much.
It was a pleasure.
Good night. We'll see you next week.
The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations 40 years ago, may not be a legally binding document. It is rather a promise made by all the members of the United Nations to the people of the world. We at Amnesty International believe that the governments who have adopted the Declaration have a moral responsibility to keep that promise.
Write Amnesty International, Post Office Box 37137, Washington, D.C. 20013.
This may be the best kept secret in the world, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. 40 years ago, the United Nations wrote and adopted it. Every single member country promised to support it, every single one. They also promised to teach, publicize, and display it. Have you ever heard of it? the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
To get your copy, write Amnesty International, P.O. Box 37137, Washington, D.C. 20013.
P.O. Box 37137, Washington, D.C. 20013.